So I have a friend who I've known for 30 years who struggles every time that she has to go on a vacation. She knows it's important with her husband, with children. She knows there's a time to create memories, that this is what you remember back of the intimacy shared together. The only problem is that she's afraid of so many things. So she's terrified of skiing. So they'll sometimes go to a ski resort, but she's the one who stays in the lounge there and has that cocoa. Right, as they're off and having the experience, some of you know ski, on the ski lift up and the rides down to be able to share.
Hey,
she
guys.
just can't be there with them.
Nice to see you. Reading. I need readers. I know you'll never read. I don't even bother, right, Max?
Is that my friend?
Okay. All right. Good.
Is that Kazan Mimi? Matt, can we cut it? You got him? It's another funny story about a rabbi friend of mine who actually didn't turn off his mic when he went to the bathroom in between sessions on high holidays. As he walked back in and everybody was sort of giggling and laughing, he realized what had happened, and he said, and looked at them and said, I'd be laughing too, I guess. You never know with technology what will happen. Where was I? Vacations of my friend who's terrified, and so skiing is out of the question. So for her, by the way, she's terrified of drowning. So she will not go in the ocean. So if they ever go somewhere where there's a beach resort, she's not to be had in that water at all. She would love to go to exotic vacations, places around the world, but she has let's say, the intestinal fortitude and disposition of problems that occur when you typically go to Mexico. And you have the wrong kind of water or food, and so she's terrified to go anywhere in the world. She knows that her life is predicated in terms of every time she thinks about vacation, she starts having this fear impulse, right? What am I going to be afraid of? What can't I do? And so she either confronts it or usually just has to endure it. There are many people who have to deal with crippling fears. I know some people you might know well, who are so afraid of flying that they will not get on an airplane to visit even close family. I won't look around at you. You don't have to point yourselves out, but I know you're out there. Right? There's this disbelief in science that somehow they believe that planes are not meant to fly. And so that fear envelops them. So what's your greatest fear? Global warming? Your health? Retirement? Being able to afford putting your kids through college without mortgaging your future? Traveling anywhere because of terrorism? Present condition of our country? If you want to know how you stack up with the rest of the country, by the way, here are the results of a survey conducted by Chapman University in April of last year. This was the top fears for people. So what was the top fear that people shared? Corrupt government officials. 60% of the people. Next, terrorist attacks. Here in America, 41%. Not having enough money for the future, 40%. Terrorism in general, 38%. Government gun control, 38%. People who I love dying, 38%. Economic financial collapse, 37%. And identity theft, now by the way, this is before Equifax, so, this would be much higher today, but then it was 37%. How many of you, with a show of hands, feel that you are more fearful today of things than you were 20 years ago? Wow. So by the way, you're not alone. According to Dr. Barry Glassner, a professor of sociology, who's written extensively on fear, he says 3 out of 4 Americans, so we were even lower in that percentage, 3 out of 4 Americans are more fearful today than they were 20 years ago. In his book, The Culture of Fear, Why Americans Are Afraid of the Wrong Things, published in 1999, we'll talk about that in a moment, he wrote, quote, part of what I find interesting about this is that overall most Americans live in what is arguably the safest time and place in human history, and yet fear levels are high and there are many, many fears. So how is it that we are so fearful today? One of the causes, of course, is how we receive information. You know that. In ancient times, and by the way, pretty much to almost modernity, in order to get news out, you'd have to have somebody, a courier, who would be on an animal and would go out as far and as fast as they could. The fastest, by the way, the Pony Express here in the United States that could quickly take mail with horses that would be exchanged. And then, by the way, I found out as I was researching this, that 2 days, the Pony Express went out of business 2 days after the transcontinental telegraph cable was finished. Because telegraph became the way that people would communicate. And then you had radio and television. And then, of course, now you have a smartphone, which any moment and every moment of the day will tell you everything you don't want to know. Many of us yearn for the days when we were not afraid to let our children go outside alone, to ride their bikes or to walk to school. Remember those days? But I want to tell you, there are no more kidnappings today than there were at the time of the Lindbergh kidnapping. There are no more kidnappings than there were then. You just know more about them because we get the news from everywhere. And even if you don't listen to the news, we have that great thing called an Amber Alert, that when it goes off on your phones, and if that doesn't create terror in your hearts itself, the idea that a child's been taken will terrify you as well. According to Glassner, fear is one of our greatest challenges, and bad fear. Fear-mongering has become too prevalent, he says, in our society. His book, published in 1999, already calls out news outlets and politicians for the culture of the fear that we are experiencing. He also acknowledges organizations that want to manipulate us, our perceptions for profit, our fears, including advocacy groups that raise money by exaggerating the prevalence of particular diseases. From Glassner's point of view, fear is not the problem. We must acknowledge the legitimate concerns and fears, but when we begin to fear so many things, so much, we're not able to deal with the real fears and issues. Isn't that true? When you begin to fear so much, that's our problem. There are many real fears. Here's where I'm afraid politics will sometimes determine your fears. Because many of you will have fears based on political leanings. For some, it will be global warming and affordable health care. For others, it will be the economy and immigration. You know which side of the political spectrum you're on just from those fears. I'm not going to stand here and tell you which fears you should be afraid of. My goal is in part to share with you that we can't elevate all fears to the level of DEFCON 1. They can't all be placed at that level because our bodies can't take it. By elevating every fear to that level, we become so overwhelmed. In Glassner's words, quote, scare topics like political terrorism, child care statists, and fire on the operating table get too much major play. In essence, he says, if you're more likely to be struck by lightning than impacted by something in life, you really shouldn't be so afraid. He writes, parents who fear kidnappings but let their children ride a bike without a helmet are acting irrationally. He points to shark attacks, violent crime, even terrorism in America as being over-feared as well. And Glassner spreads his blame around from the left to the right to everybody who is out there fear-mongering. And things have gotten so much worse since he wrote that book in 1999 that he republished it in 2010. And here's the new title: Why Americans Are Afraid of the Wrong Things. That's where it stopped last time. Now there's a colon. Crime, drugs, minorities, teens, moms, color kids, mutant microbes, plane crashes, road rage, and so much more. As if all those are the greatest fears of our life. The first thing to know about fear is that it's an essential emotion, part of our survival instinct. You know that. You learned it. We all learned it in grade school or in junior high school, that fight or flight instinct that we have. It's our Darwinian survivalist instinct that is responsible for our genetic survival. But you all know that feeling. I don't have to share with you the chemical reactions that take place in your brain and how adrenaline and cortisol and all kinds of things impact you. What happens when you start becoming afraid? Does your heart beat faster? Does it feel like sometimes right, come out of your chest? And what about your breathing? All of a sudden you start breathing heavier and you just feel that sense of fear and you're wondering why you're so fearful and all you're doing is watching the news. Haven't you had those moments? Why do our bodies respond so quickly to fear? Because according to Dr. Rick Hansen, author of books on neurosciences, it's because the flight or fight instinct is hardwired into our brains. Our brains, by the way, are looking for bad news. That's where we go. You know that. You go there the first place, don't you? So he says, here's his quote, "The brain is like Velcro for negative experiences and like Teflon for positive ones." According to Hansen, our brain evolves to make sure our ancestors survived by tricking us into three things. 1, overestimating threats. 2, underestimating opportunities. And 3, underestimating resources for dealing with the threat. For Hansen, quote, "This was a great way to pass on gene copies, but a lousy way to promote a quality of life." How does fear paralyze you sometimes from doing things that you know are the right thing to do? So this Sunday, Chazan Stein and I and the choir and members of Temple Aliyah are going to be going to the Greater Zion Church in Compton. We've been there before for their prayer services. It's a lovely sense of fellowship. But the first time someone from the valley thinks about going to Compton, they're not getting in their cars so quickly, are they? But the truth of the matter is, we drive out there. It's a nice neighborhood. No fear. It's only that fear in our head that would stop us from ever thinking about that opportunity. Think about how often fear stops you from doing something that either brings you joy or helps the world. On the other hand, overcoming the fear factor can also lead to some of your most joyful experiences. For some people, it's skydiving or zip lining or things that will bring joy. I learned about overcoming the fear factor from my own daughter, Talia, when she was about 10 years old. Talia was very cautious as a child, would never go anywhere risky at all. She was a child, by the way, that we would put on the countertop in the kitchen, and you could walk around and do whatever you wanted to, and she wouldn't move. We never had to baby-proof the house until our 4th kid, by the way. And honest to God, that's my Avi. He's a whole nother story, by the way. But so Talia was never, if we went to amusement parks, she would never go onto the roller coasters, even those little tiny ones, no, she wasn't about to. But she really wanted to go on Splash Mountain. She would look and she'd say it looks great, but she saw that dive. She saw how far that thing would come down the mountain. So we finally convinced her to go on. You really don't know how high you are until you really get up there as well. And we assured her we'd be in the back of the car and I'm going to hold on to you, don't worry. So we get in the car, and all of a sudden, she's grabbing tightly onto me, and she starts crying. And there's no way out now. And we're heading for that drop. And I hear her crying. And all of a sudden, we do that drop. Woo! And you know that moment when you don't know if you've done a bad thing for your kid or not? You know that moment? So I hear her, there's some crying, but I hear all of a sudden, I'm looking over, and I just hear her saying this, again. Overcoming our fears. Sometimes it's not easy. If you want to live a good life, you've got to figure out how to do that when it's stopping you from the important things of life. That's the power of fear, to stop us. Aside from Glasser's concerns that unnecessary fear distracts us from dealing with the real fears of life, there's the question of how fear impacts our bodies. If you don't know this, by the way, fear, what you think is just in your mind, impacts your bodies. There are studies that have been done dealing with all kinds of hormones and things that we secrete, that our bodies are impacted in terms of the very most dangerous things that we do. The problem is that our bodies, that we were designed for a different reality. So a friend of mine who's very much into mindfulness gave me this model that she was taught about, that we humans were designed in terms of our fear instinct to be traveling on the plains and savannas, to be hunters and gatherers. And when we are hunters, we're out there. But when we see something of danger, we have to get away quickly. Right? We're designed, our fear factor, when we see tigers, that we run really quickly. That our hearts start pumping, the adrenaline that's going, that everything that you feel is moving your body as fast as you can to get away from that tiger. The problem is that we live today in a world of fear, and there are no more tigers chasing us, but every fear becomes a tiger. That's what happens to our bodies. And as a result, physiological reactions that take place, here's what the studies show. Fear and anxiety can cause cardiovascular damage, gastrointestinal problems, ulcers, decreased fertility, diabetes, accelerated aging, premature death. That's what fear and anxiety can do to you. That's physical, physiology. Now, emotionally, by the way, depression and other signs that are created from this fear, that when we have it too much in our lives. And the third area that fear impacts is it poisons our souls. Because it impacts how you treat others and how they pass it on. When we become fearful, we become more suspicious of people and less likely to trust them. Isn't that true? You become less trustful. Fear may speed up our heart rate, but it actually constricts our compassion. That's the problem. By succumbing to fear, we close our hearts and we don't let love out. That's the power it has over us. We can't let fear turn us into people that we don't want to be. The impact of fear is not only on us, but by the way, on our children. They have found that fear, anxiety, and those issues can be passed down genetically in your DNA. So I want you to imagine now, for a generation that's growing up with this kind of fear, getting married later in life and having children later in life, how that DNA may be impacted. The most common word for fear, by the way, in the Bible is yirah. Yirah is fear. More than 80 times, though, the Bible tells us, al tirah, do not fear. As if to tell us, take fear and be very careful about it. If you think about most things, you really don't have to be afraid. The one exception, the areta me'elohecha, you shall fear God. So what is fear about, or this yirah that the rabbis talk about? They want to translate it into awe, a sense of awe of the universe. In fact, by the way, these days we're in are called the Yamim Noraim, correct? Those of you who know this Hebrew. The word norah is from the Hebrew word yirah, which means fear, but we don't translate this days of fear. We translate it as days of awe. That's what we should have. It's awe and majesty. According to Rabbi Brad Arson, traditional sources speak of two forms of yirah. One which is considered unworthy of serious consideration. That is the fear of the consequences of God's power. By the way, if you listen to Rabbi Goldstein and how to understand God potentially, the higher yirah, Rabbi Arson says, is, quote, an attitude of mind and soul which man is filled with a sense of awe at the contemplation of the great majesty of the world. The higher yirah is one that calls upon the best within us, mustering our humility and reverence in response to the wonder of being. But in the Torah, we're commanded not only to fear God, but to love God. And if you want to know what the rabbis want us to focus on, what's one of our most important prayers of our prayer service? What is it? The Shema. And what is Ve'ahavta about? You shall what? Love. Shall love the Lord your God. That love is supposed to be dominant, and fear is supposed to be taken back from that love. And Rabbi Naomi Levy, by the way, who's our scholar in residence in November, you'll have to come hear her. She just wrote a new book, Einstein and the Rabbi, and she's wonderful. She describes the balance in our lives between love and fear. She writes, quote, there are two different divine attributes. They are love and fear. Love and fear are always keeping each other in check, like yin and yang. Love is an outpouring that flows from the soul. It pours and spreads like water. That's where the second divine attribute, fear, comes in. Fear is here to counterbalance love. It's not about overwhelming us. She writes, not lower level fear that cripples us, but holy fear. Holy fear is restraint and awe and trembling. The fear of losing things when we don't do it right. Stop, it says. Holy fear is a voice that says, think before you leap. Weigh the consequences before you act. Take a moment to contemplate before you hit send. Recognize the beauty of what you have before you trample all over it. Rabbi Levy suggests that we must transform that crippling effect. We have to wake up and understand what fear does to us. We have to understand. We have to overcome it. We have to recognize when it's real in our world, but we have to understand when it's poisoning our soul and it is turning us into people we do not desire to be. That everything cannot be DEFCON 1, but we must be able to find holy fear that helps us challenge. It's love and fear that help us walk that right path of life. You see, when we bring love and goodness to the world, we help diminish the fear. Isn't that true in your lives? Each of you has the ability to help take fear out of this world. And yet often, we bring it into this world. When we believe in the world and those around us, when we don't feel alone, fear begins to subside. Fear is real and important for survival. You just have to learn how to live off of the savannah, to remember that the tigers are not there anymore. Diminish our fear intake, bring more love into the world, transform our fears into holy fears. This is a formula for a good year. I want to wish you a Gemar Chatima Tova. May you be sealed for a good year of love and less fear. And let us all say, Amen.